Do you think you can? Mrs. Collins asked the question with a smile that looked anything but kind, sharp enough to be felt from where Annie was sitting. She placed the test on Annie's desk with both hands, as if it were something heavy and important. It was thicker than every other paper in the classroom. The other children had been given single worksheets with large numbers, cheerful boxes, and little pictures of apples and stars in the margins. Annie's paper was different. It had several pages, smaller print, longer questions, number patterns, shape puzzles, word problems, and diagrams that did not look like anything Mrs. Collins had taught the class that week. Mrs. Collins tapped the first page with one polished fingernail. "This one is going to be harder than the others," she said. Her voice was gentle enough for the visitors in the back row to think she was being kind. "Much harder. I don't want you to feel bad if you can't finish it." Annie looked up at her. Mrs. Collins leaned a little closer. "Honestly, I'm not sure you'll be able to do it." Annie's hands rested on either side of the test. She was sitting at a small desk near the tall window away from the tables where the other children sat together. "I think I can," Annie said quietly. "I'll try." Mrs. Collins gave a soft laugh. "Trying is fine, sweetheart. But remember, this is about the scholarship review. If you can't solve it, I won't force you. I'll simply have to reconsider whether you're ready for that kind of opportunity." Annie lowered her eyes to the test. She could feel everyone looking, even the people who pretended not to. At the back of the classroom, Daniel Whitaker sat in a gray suit with an untouched cup of coffee beside him. Principal Richard Howard sat to his right, wearing the polished smile of a man who had welcomed rich donors many times before. Grace Miller, a girl with pink glasses and a kind face, raised her hand. Mrs. Collins turned. "Yes, Grace." Grace looked at Annie's thick packet. "Why does Annie have a different test?" Mrs. Collins' smile tightened for less than a second. "That's a good question," she said. "Annie is being considered for a scholarship, and students on that list have to show they can handle more advanced work." Grace frowned. "But we're all in the same class." "Yes," Mrs. Collins said, still smiling. "But not every child is being considered for the same things. Annie has to prove she's ready." Annie stared at the top of the paper. One of the parents seated near the back shifted slightly. Mrs. Caldwell, Ethan Caldwell's mother, leaned just enough for Mrs. Collins to see her and gave the teacher a quick wink. It was a tiny thing, a little signal, gone almost instantly, but Daniel saw it. Mrs. Collins saw it, too, and something in her shoulders relaxed. That wink seemed to tell her she had support. If Annie failed, it would not be called unfair. It would be called standards. If Annie froze, it would not be called humiliation. It would be called evidence. Mrs. Collins clapped her hands once. "All right, class, begin. Remember, neat numbers show neat thinking." Pencils started moving. Annie wrote her name at the top of the first page. Anaya. Her letters were careful and rounded. She pressed the pencil a little too hard, leaving dark marks in the paper. Then she looked at the first problem. RCB Shalou. She knew it right away. Doubling 64. The next one made her pause, but only because she liked it. San Wu Ba. Each number carried the 2 before it. It felt like a family of numbers, one leaning on another until something new appeared. 21. Mrs. Collins moved through the room with practiced sweetness. "Very nice, Ethan. Beautiful work, Grace. Take your time, Olivia." Then she came to Annie's desk much sooner than she needed to. Annie had just started a shape problem. It showed a large square divided into smaller squares, and the question asked how many squares could be found altogether. Annie bit the end of her pencil, staring carefully at the picture. She counted the smallest squares first, then the medium ones. Her brow drew together. Mrs. Collins saw the frown and smiled. "Already stuck." Annie took the pencil from her mouth. "No, ma'am, I'm just counting." "Counting can be difficult when there are too many pieces," Mrs. Collins said lightly. "Don't be embarrassed." "I'm not embarrassed," Annie said. She did not say it loudly. She did not say it rudely. But Mrs. Collins' eyes cooled anyway. "Then continue." Annie looked back at the diagram. She wrote one answer, hesitated, then erased it because she wanted to check the medium squares again. The eraser left a faint gray smudge. Mrs. Collins gave a short laugh. "Oh, Annie," she said loud enough now for the front table to hear. "This is what happens when we rush into work we aren't ready for." Annie's cheeks warmed. "I'm not rushing." Mrs. Collins tilted her head. "Then why are you erasing?" "Because I'm checking." Mrs. Collins' smile became thin. "Checking is good. Guessing and then erasing is not." At the back of the room, Daniel's hand tightened around the armrest. Principal Howard leaned closer and whispered. "Mrs. Collins is very thorough." Daniel did not take his eyes off Annie. "That isn't what I would call it." Annie forced herself to look back at the problem. Small squares, medium squares, 1 large square. She wrote the answer again, this time without erasing. Mrs. Collins lingered for another moment as if waiting for the child's courage to collapse. When it did not, she walked away. Annie moved to the next page. There was a word problem about apples and baskets. She read it slowly. Then she read it again. Some of the words were not difficult, but they were arranged in a way that tried to make the simple thing hide. She bit the pencil again, her eyes narrowing. She wrote a small number in the margin, crossed it out, and tried another arrangement. Mrs. Collins drifted back. You know, she said, if this is too much, I can let another student try the harder section. Annie looked up. Mrs. Collins glanced toward the front of the room. Ethan usually enjoys a challenge. Ethan sat taller when he heard his name. Mrs. Caldwell smiled faintly from the back. Annie's stomach tightened. It was not enough for Mrs. Collins to make her fail. She wanted another child to succeed in her place while everyone watched. She wanted the room to understand who was supposed to shine and who was supposed to be grateful for being allowed in the room at all. Annie held her pencil with both hands for a second. I can solve it, she said. Mrs. Collins lifted her eyebrows. Are you sure? Yes, ma'am. Please don't give it away. I just need a little time. Well, Mrs. Collins said finally, then use your time wisely. She moved away, but her eyes kept returning to Annie's desk. Annie bent over the paper. Now every sound felt larger. Mrs. Collins' shoes tapped across the floor, then paused, then tapped again. Every few moments, the teacher circled back with another comment. Still working. Remember, Annie, there's no shame in admitting when something is too hard. That mark is awfully dark. Are you sure about it? Don't overthink. That can make children confused. Each sentence landed on the desk like another paper placed on top of the test. Annie wrote, erased, rewrote. Her brow furrowed. She bit the pencil so hard once that little tooth marks appeared in the yellow paint. Mrs. Collins saw them and gave another pleased little laugh. You're going to chew that pencil in half before you find the answer. Some of the adults chuckled politely. Danielle did not. Annie's eyes flickered toward him. He sat still, but his expression had changed. Now he was looking at Mrs. Collins the same way. Annie turned back to the test. She solved the apple basket problem, then the next number sequence, then the shape comparison, then the longer problem with 3 steps hidden inside one paragraph. Page by page, Annie worked through the packet, not quickly anymore. When she reached the final page, the room had changed. The visitors were no longer watching Mrs. Collins' lesson. They were watching Annie. Grace had stopped pretending to focus on her own paper. Ethan's tapping had gone quiet. Mrs. Caldwell no longer looked amused. Principal Howard had begun to shift in his chair as though the room had grown too warm. Mrs. Collins returned once more. Well, she asked, have you finally reached the end? Annie nodded. The final problem was printed in bold. 4 apples must be divided into 5 groups. Each group must contain an odd number of apples. All apples must be used. How many apples are in each group? Annie read it. Then she read it again. Her pencil stopped. Mrs. Collins saw the pause and smiled. There it is, she said softly. Annie did not answer. Mrs. Collins tapped the desk. Annie, she said almost cheerfully. If you can't finish it, I'm sure Ethan would be glad to show us what he can do. Annie looked up. No, ma'am. Mrs. Collins blinked. No, I finished the test. That made Mrs. Collins' smile falter. Annie pushed the packet forward with both hands, but the last question is wrong. The room went silent. Mrs. Collins stared at her. What did you say? Annie's voice stayed small, but it did not shake. The question says, 24 apples have to go into 5 groups, and every group has to have an odd number. That can't happen. Mrs. Collins gave a quick laugh, but it sounded different now. Not pleased, not relaxed. Of course, it can. You simply haven't found the answer. Annie shook her head. 5 odd numbers always add to an odd number. 24 is even. Annie shook her head. 5 odd numbers always add to an odd number. 24 is even. Grace whispered. She's right. Mrs. Collins turned sharply. Grace, eyes on your own paper. Grace dropped her gaze, but the damage had been done. Someone else had heard the truth. Mrs. Collins snatched up Annie's test and scanned the final problem. Her eyes moved left to right, then back again. The color in her cheeks changed. Daniel stood halfway from his chair, then stopped. Mrs. Collins placed the paper back down. No, she said. Annie looked confused. Ma'am. Mrs. Collins' voice hardened. The problem is not wrong simply because you cannot solve it. But I did solve the other ones, Annie said. You attempted them. I finished them. That remains to be checked. Annie looked down at the packet. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Collins leaned closer. Her smile was gone now. Do you understand how serious it is to accuse a teacher of making a mistake in front of guests? Annie's eyes widened. I'm not accusing you. That is exactly what you are doing. No, ma'am. I'm just saying the numbers don't work. Mrs. Collins looked toward the back of the room, toward Mrs. Caldwell, toward Principal Howard, toward the board members, and finally toward Daniel Whitaker. She seemed to remember all at once that this was supposed to be her perfect lesson. So, she laughed again. Well, she said, turning to the class. It appears Annie believes she has found an error in the test. No one laughed with her. The silence made her face tighten further. She looked back at Annie. If you are so certain, she said, then perhaps you should explain it to everyone. Annie froze. The test was no longer just paper. It had become a stage, and Mrs. Collins was trying to push her onto it. At the back of the room, Daniel leaned forward, his coffee long forgotten. Principal Howard whispered, I'm sure Mrs. Collins has this under control. Daniel's voice was quiet. No, he said, she doesn't. Mrs. Collins held Annie's test as if the pages themselves had offended her. Mrs. Collins turned a page, then another. She was not really checking the whole test. Daniel could see that from the back of the room. Her eyes skimmed too fast. She was looking for a mistake. Any mistake. Something she could hold up like evidence that the child had no right to challenge the final question. But the longer she looked, the tighter her mouth became. Well, Mrs. Collins said at last, you have written quite a bit. Annie nodded carefully. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Collins placed the packet back on the desk, but kept one hand over it, as if Annie might take it away. Writing answers and understanding them are two very different things. I know, Annie said. That simple answer seemed to bother Mrs. Collins more than an argument would have. She glanced toward the back of the room, where Daniel sat forward in his chair, his face still and unreadable. Principal Howard looked as if he wished someone would ring the fire alarm. Mrs. Collins drew in a breath. Come up here, Annie. Grace made a small sound, barely more than a breath. Annie looked from her teacher to the front of the room. To the board. Yes, Mrs. Collins said. If you believe the problem is wrong, then you can explain it to the class. We all want to learn, don't we? Annie slid down from her chair. Her shoes touched the floor with a soft tap. She picked up the test because she was not sure whether she was allowed to leave it, then set it down again when Mrs. Collins' eyes narrowed. She walked toward the front with her shoulders slightly raised as if bracing for cold wind. The classroom was not large, but that walk felt long. Annie passed Grace's table. Grace looked at her with worried eyes and whispered, It's okay. Mrs. Collins heard it. Grace, we do not whisper during assessments. Grace looked down. Annie reached the whiteboard. The marker tray was too high for her to reach comfortably, so she stood on the tips of her shoes and took a black marker. It squeaked when she uncapped it. That sound seemed very loud. Mrs. Collins stood beside her. Go ahead. Show us why you think an official assessment question is wrong. The word official was not accidental. It placed the school, the teacher, the system, and the adults on one side. On the other side stood Annie, a small child with a marker in her hand. Annie looked at the problem on the paper. She did not write the whole thing. She wrote only what mattered. 5 odd numbers equals odd. Then she wrote, fear enta. Her handwriting on the board was uneven because her hand was shaking. She stared at the words for a second, then turned around. If there are 5 groups, she said, and every group has an odd number, then when you add them all together, the answer has to be odd. Mrs. Collins crossed her arms. Why? Annie blinked. Because odd plus odd is even. Then if you add another odd, it becomes odd again. It keeps changing, but with 5 odd numbers, it ends on odd. A boy near the front whispered, Oh, Mrs. Collins shot him a look, and he bent over his worksheet. Annie continued a little more quietly. But 24 is even, so all the apples can't be used if every group has to be odd. Mrs. Collins took the marker from Annie's hand. Thank you, she said, but there was no thanks in it. You may sit down. Annie took one step toward her desk. Then Mrs. Collins added, and next time we will remember that there is a respectful way to ask for clarification. Annie stopped. Daniel did too. His hand had been resting on the arm of the chair. Now it pressed down once slowly as if he were reminding himself not to rise too quickly. Annie turned back. I'm sorry, she said, because children often apologize when adults make them afraid, even when they have not done anything wrong. Mrs. Collins smiled. That's better. Something changed in Daniel's face. Principal Howard saw it and leaned toward him. Mr. Whitaker, perhaps we should let the lesson continue. Mrs. Collins is very experienced with young children. Daniel did not answer right away. His eyes were on Annie, who had returned to her small desk by the window. She sat down carefully, smoothing her skirt as if neatness might protect her. Howard tried again, softer. These moments can look more dramatic than they are. In a classroom, teachers sometimes have to correct tone as much as content. Daniel turned his head slowly, her tone. Howard's mouth opened, then closed. Daniel looked back toward the front. Mrs. Collins had resumed the lesson with an unnatural brightness. She asked Ethan to read his answer to a simple pattern problem. Ethan did so proudly, and Mrs. Collins praised him as if he had carried water across a desert. Wonderful, Ethan. That is exactly the confidence we like to see. Mrs. Caldwell smiled. The smile was smaller now, but it was there. Annie looked down at her own test. The final question was still wrong. The other answers were still right, but somehow she felt as if she had lost something. At the front of the room, Mrs. Collins said, "Class, let's all turn our papers over. We are going to discuss effort." Mrs. Collins walked slowly between the tables. Sometimes we are given work that feels too difficult. When that happens, we do not become upset. We do not blame the question. We do not try to embarrass the person who gave us the work. We practice humility. Annie's eyes remained on her desk. Grace looked angry now. In the helpless way. Children become angry when they know something is wrong, but do not yet know what power they have. Mrs. Collins stopped near Annie's corner. "Isn't that right, Annie?" Annie's lips parted, but no sound came out. Daniel stood, not abruptly, not loudly. He simply rose from the back row, buttoned his suit jacket, and stepped into the aisle. Every adult in the room noticed. See, Principal Howard half rose. "Mr. Whitaker." Daniel did not look at him. "Please sit down, Richard." The use of the principal's first name landed like a gavel. Howard said. Mrs. Collins turned, still holding her teacher's smile, though it had begun to tremble at the edges. "Mr. Whitaker, is there something you'd like to add?" Daniel walked toward the front of the room. His steps were even, measured, quiet against the classroom rug. He stopped beside Annie's desk first, not at the board, not beside Mrs. Collins. Beside Annie, he looked down at her test. Page after page of careful work, tiny eraser marks, dark pencil lines, a finished assessment that should have earned praise long before it earned suspicion. Then he looked at Mrs. Collins. "Yes," he said, "there is." Annie looked up at him, eyes wide. She remembered the rule. At school, he was Mr. Whitaker. In front of everyone, she was not supposed to reach for him, but Daniel saw her fingers curl around the edge of the desk, and it took every ounce of discipline he possessed not to take her hand. Mrs. Collins lifted her chin. "We were just having a teachable moment." Daniel's voice stayed calm. "No, you were having a public correction of a child who solved the problem correctly." A murmur moved through the adults in the back. Mrs. Collins flushed. "With respect, Mr. Whitaker, classroom management can be misunderstood by observers. I understand what I observed. I'm sure it may seem that way, but Annie has a tendency to challenge instructions." Daniel glanced at Annie. "Did she refuse the test?" Mrs. Collins hesitated. "No. But did she disrupt the class?" "No. But did she speak disrespectfully?" Mrs. Collins' mouth tightened. She claimed the test was wrong. And was it? The question was quiet, but it emptied the room. Mrs. Collins looked at the board where Annie's simple proof still remained. 5 odd numbers equal an odd total. 24 equals even. The truth sat there in black marker, too plain to dress up and too solid to move aside. "That is not the point," Mrs. Collins said. Daniel's expression hardened. "It is exactly the point." Mrs. Collins lowered her voice. "Mr. Whitaker, I appreciate your interest, but Annie is not your concern." Principal Howard closed his eyes for half a second. Daniel became very still, but he did not reveal it yet. He looked at Annie first because whatever came next had to protect her, not merely expose Mrs. Collins. "Annie," he said gently, "did Mrs. Collins give everyone the same test?" Annie looked at her teacher, then at Daniel. "No, sir." "Did she tell you your scholarship could be reconsidered if you couldn't solve it?" Annie swallowed. "Yes, sir." "Did you ask for a little time?" "Yes, sir." "And did you finish the test?" Annie nodded. "Yes, sir. Except the last one. Because it doesn't work." Daniel's gaze returned to Mrs. Collins. Mrs. Collins folded her arms. "I will not have my lesson turned into an accusation." Daniel's voice lowered. "Then don't turn your authority into a weapon." Mrs. Collins stared at him, stunned. Daniel glanced once more at Annie's paper. At the erased marks, the careful answers. The final impossible question. Then he looked toward Principal Howard. "This observation is over," he said. Howard rose quickly. "Mr. Whitaker, perhaps we can step into my office and discuss." "We will," Daniel said. "After Mrs. Collins answers one question." Mrs. Collins' face had gone pale beneath her makeup. What question? Daniel turned back to her. When a child tells the truth in your classroom, he asked. Do you always make her apologize for it? If this story moved you, take a moment to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and tell us where you are watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this. Annie looked down at her hands, and for the first time that morning, Mrs. Collins had no answer. Mrs. Collins did not answer. For a few seconds, she simply stood there, her arms folded, her expression caught somewhere between offense and calculation. The question Daniel had asked did not require a complicated explanation. It required honesty, and honesty was the one thing she could not afford in that moment. Principal Howard stepped forward quickly, his voice soft but urgent. Mr. Whitaker, perhaps we should continue this conversation privately. Daniel did not move. Not yet. The calm in his voice made it impossible to interrupt him again. He turned slightly, not toward the adults in the back, but toward the children. His gaze passed over Ethan, who had gone very still, then over Grace, whose hands were clenched together on her desk, and finally back to Annie. Annie had not moved from her seat. Her small fingers were still curled at the edge of the desk, the same way they had been when she finished the test. She was watching Daniel now, not with fear, but with something quieter, something that looked like hope she wasn't sure she was allowed to feel yet. Mrs. Collins found her voice again, though it came out thinner than before. This is highly inappropriate. You are disrupting a classroom environment. Daniel looked at her. No, he said. The disruption started long before I stood up. Mrs. Collins drew herself up, trying to regain the authority she felt slipping. You are a guest here, Mr. Whitaker. I expect you to respect the professional boundaries of my classroom. There was a murmur among the parents. Daniel nodded once slowly. You're right. I am a guest. He let that sit for a moment, then added. But she isn't. He did not raise his voice. He did not gesture yet. Something in the room shifted again. Deeper this time, like a door opening that no one had realized was locked. Mrs. Collins frowned. I don't understand what you mean. Daniel glanced down at Annie's test again, then at the small pencil with the bite marks along its edge. His jaw tightened just enough for those close to him to notice. You asked her to prove she belonged here. He said you gave her a different test. You told her her scholarship could be taken away. You interrupted her while she worked. You laughed when she checked her answers. And when she finished, you told her she was being disrespectful for telling the truth. Mrs. Collins' lips parted. That is not what happened. Daniel's eyes did not leave her. Then correct me. She hesitated. That hesitation said more than any defense could have. At the back of the room, Mrs. Caldwell shifted in her seat. The confidence she had shown earlier had faded. She looked toward Principal Howard as if expecting him to take control of the situation, but Howard remained still, his expression tight, his hands clasped in front of him. Mrs. Collins tried again, her tone sharper now. Annie is a scholarship candidate. She needs to be evaluated more rigorously than the other students. That is not discrimination. That is responsibility. Daniel tilted his head slightly. Responsibility to whom? To the standards of this institution. And those standards require isolating a child and setting her up to fail. I did not set her up to fail. You gave her a problem that cannot be solved. Mrs. Collins' voice rose. She misunderstood the problem. Annie spoke before she could stop herself. I didn't misunderstand. The room froze again. Annie's eyes widened slightly as if she had surprised herself. Mrs. Collins turned to her sharply. Annie. Daniel lifted his hand, not in anger, but in quiet interruption. Let her speak. It was not a request. Mrs. Collins pressed her lips together. Annie swallowed, then looked at the paper on her desk, not at Mrs. Collins. 5 odd numbers always make an odd total, she said softly. 24 is even, so it can't be right. No one argued with her. Even Mrs. Collins did not because she couldn't. Daniel nodded once almost imperceptibly. Thank you. That was all he said to Annie. But the word carried something more than acknowledgement. It carried respect, the kind that had been missing from every other adult voice in the room that morning. Mrs. Collins shifted her weight. Even if there was an error, she said quickly. The way Annie presented it was inappropriate. There are proper channels. Children are not supposed to challenge authority in front of others. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, authority that cannot be questioned is not authority. It's insecurity. A board member coughed softly. Principal Howard stepped forward again, his voice more strained now. Mr. Whitaker, we truly value your perspective, but this is becoming unproductive. Daniel turned to him. Unproductive for whom? Howard opened his mouth, then closed it again. Daniel continued. You invited me here to observe how this school teaches. I'm observing. The word landed harder than it should have. Mrs. Collins' composure began to crack. This is unfair. You are taking one moment out of context and turning it into one moment. Daniel interrupted gently. You think this started today? She froze. That question was more dangerous than the others because it suggested history, because it suggested pattern. Grace looked up again, her expression uncertain but thoughtful, as if she were remembering things she had not fully understood before. Mrs. Collins recovered quickly. If you have concerns, you can bring them to the administration. But you cannot stand in my classroom and interrogate me in front of my students. Daniel's expression did not change. I'm not interrogating you. He took one step closer. I'm holding you accountable. The word accountability hung in the air like something heavy. Mrs. Collins laughed once, but it was brittle. Accountable for giving a student a challenging assignment. Daniel's voice stayed calm. For how you chose which student to challenge, and how silence followed, Annie sat very still. She had never heard adults speak like this before. Not like Mrs. Collins, who spoke in rules, and not like Principal Howard, who spoke in careful phrases. Daniel's words felt different. They did not twist. They did not hide. They landed where they were meant to land. Mrs. Collins' eyes flickered toward the back of the room again, toward the parents, toward Mrs. Caldwell. But no one was nodding now. No one was smiling. She was alone. That realization changed her posture more than anything else. Her shoulders lowered slightly, her voice lost its sharp edge. I think, she said, choosing her words carefully. Now, this situation is being exaggerated. Daniel shook his head once. No, it's being seen. That was worse because exaggeration could be denied. Being seen could not. Principal Howard stepped forward more decisively this time. All right, that's enough. We're going to pause this session. Mrs. Collins, please step outside for a moment. Mrs. Collins turned to him, startled. Excuse me, you heard me. This is my classroom. And right now, Howard said, his voice tight. This is my school. That was the first time he had asserted authority all morning. It came late, but it came. Mrs. Collins hesitated, then gathered herself. She placed her hands together in front of her, nodded once to no one in particular, and walked toward the door. Her steps were controlled, but there was a stiffness to them now, a loss of ease that had been present earlier. The door closed behind her. The room exhaled. Children shifted in their seats. A chair creaked. Someone let out a breath they had been holding too long. Principal Howard turned back to Daniel, his face pale. Mr. Whitaker, I assure you, we take matters like this very seriously. Daniel did not respond immediately. He looked at Annie instead. She was still sitting at the small desk by the window, still separate, still quiet, but something in her posture had changed. She was no longer shrinking into the chair. She was sitting upright, her hands resting on the desk, her eyes clear. She had spoken, and she had not been silenced. Daniel walked back toward her slowly. He stopped beside her desk again, just as he had before. Are you all right? He asked. Annie nodded. Yes, sir. She still used the formal word, still followed the rule. Daniel gave a small, almost invisible nod, as if acknowledging that she had done everything right. You did good work, he said. Annie's fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the desk. Thank you. It was a simple exchange, but it repaired something. Not everything, but something. Daniel straightened and turned back toward Principal Howard. We're not done, he said. Howard swallowed. Of course not. And for the first time that morning, the power in the room had shifted completely. Not because someone had shouted, not because someone had demanded it, but because the truth had been spoken, and someone with the authority to protect it had finally chosen to stand. Principal Howard adjusted his tie, though it did nothing to steady him. The room still carried the echo of what had just happened. Not in sound, but in the way people held themselves careful now, aware that something ordinary had been broken open and could not be put back the same way. We'll take a short break, Howard said, forcing a practiced calm into his voice. Children, please remain seated. Mrs. Parker will come in to supervise. A teaching assistant from the hallway stepped in quietly, her eyes moving quickly between Annie, Daniel, and the empty space where Mrs. Collins had been standing moments before. She sensed what had happened without needing it, explained. Howard gestured toward the door. Mr. Whitaker, if you join me. Daniel did not move right away. His gaze lingered on Annie for a second longer, as if measuring whether leaving her even for a few minutes would undo what had just been restored. Annie met his eyes and gave a small nod. It was subtle, but it was enough. Daniel followed Howard out into the hallway. The door closed behind them with a soft click, but the silence it left in the classroom felt louder than anything that had been said. Outside, the hallway smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long lines across the floor. It was the kind of place designed to feel calm, respectable, controlled. Howard exhaled slowly. I want to apologize, he said. That situation escalated in a way we did not anticipate. Daniel stood with his hands in his pockets, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp. It didn't escalate, he said. It revealed itself. Howard hesitated. Mrs. Collins has been with us for over 20 years. She's one of our most experienced educators. That makes this worse, Daniel replied. Howard's jaw tightened slightly. You have to understand, managing a classroom involves nuance. Sometimes teachers apply pressure to see how students respond. Daniel turned his head slightly. Pressure. Howard nodded as if relieved to have found a word he could stand behind. Yes, especially for scholarship candidates. We need to ensure they can handle expectations. Daniel let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh, but there was no humor in it. You call that pressure, I call it targeting. Howard opened his mouth to respond, but Daniel continued before he could. She was isolated, given different material, interrupted repeatedly, der man-mind in front of her peers, and when she succeeded, she was corrected not for being wrong, but for being right in a way that made the teacher uncomfortable. Howard looked away for a moment toward the row of framed photographs lining the wall. Graduating classes, awards ceremonies, smiling children frozen in perfect rows. That is not how we intend to operate, he said quietly. But it is how you operated, Daniel replied. The distinction mattered. Howard turned back to him. We will address this, I assure you. Mrs. Collins will be spoken to. Daniel shook his head slightly. No, she will be investigated. Howard stiffened. That's a serious step, so is what happened in that room. There was a pause. Howard folded his hands in front of him. The gesture of a man trying to regain control of a situation that had slipped beyond polite language. Mr. Whitaker, we value your partnership with this school. Your support has made a significant difference. Daniel's eyes lifted and Howard stopped mid-sentence. Don't, Daniel said. The word was quiet, but it carried enough weight to end the direction of the conversation entirely. Don't make this about donations, Daniel continued. Or partnerships are what I bring to this school, Howard swallowed. This is about what you allowed to happen to a child. The hallway felt narrower now. Inside the classroom, Annie sat at her desk, her test still in front of her. The teaching assistant, Mrs. Parker, moved gently between the tables, speaking softly to the children, encouraging them to stay calm, to keep their voices down. But the class was no longer thinking about math. Grace leaned slightly toward Annie. You were right, she whispered. Annie glanced at her, then back at the paper. I just followed the numbers. Grace hesitated. Are you in trouble? Annie thought about that. The question felt familiar. Too familiar. I don't know, she said. Across the room, Ethan shifted in his seat. He looked less certain now, his earlier confidence gone. He glanced toward the door, then back at Annie, then quickly down at his own paper. The room had changed for all of them. Back in the hallway, Howard spoke again, more carefully this time. What would you like to see happen? Daniel considered the question, but not for long. I want a formal review. I want the classroom footage from today, and I want to know whether this is an isolated incident or a pattern. Howard nodded slowly. We can arrange that, and Daniel added, I want Annie removed from that classroom immediately. Howard blinked. You're withdrawing her. I'm protecting her. The difference landed heavily. Howard took a breath. We can move her to another class temporarily while we sort this out. Today, Daniel said. Yes, Howard replied quickly. Of course, today. There was another pause, quieter this time. Howard looked at Daniel with something closer to honesty. Now, may I ask you something? Daniel gave a slight nod. Why didn't you say anything sooner? Daniel's gaze shifted briefly toward the classroom door. I wanted to see. See what? How she would be treated when no one thought it mattered. Howard did not answer because the answer was already clear. Daniel straightened slightly. And now I've seen enough. Inside the classroom, Annie reached for her pencil again, almost without thinking. She turned it slowly in her fingers, feeling the small dents where her teeth had pressed into the wood. The test lay open, every answer filled in, every page complete except the last question that had never been solvable. She looked at it for a long moment. Then, quietly, she closed the packet. Not because she was done with it, but because she no longer needed to prove anything to it. The door opened, every head turned. Daniel stepped back into the room, followed by Principal Howard. The air shifted again, not with tension this time, but with something steadier, something resolved. Daniel walked directly to Annie. He didn't rush, he didn't make a scene, but there was no hesitation in his steps now. Annie looked up at him. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then Daniel said softly, but clearly enough for the room to hear. You won't be staying in this class. A flicker of confusion crossed Annie's face. Did I do something wrong? The question landed harder than anything else that morning. Daniel shook his head. No. He paused, choosing his words carefully. You did everything right. Annie held his gaza, and for the first time that day, something inside her seemed to settle. Not completely, but enough. Behind them, Principal Howard addressed the class, his voice formal again, but lacking its earlier ease. Students, there will be a schedule adjustment. Annie will be reassigned starting immediately. There were whispers. Grace looked at Annie with wide eyes. Are you leaving? Annie hesitated, then nodded slightly. Grace swallowed. Can I still sit with you at lunch? Annie's lips curved just a little. I think so. It wasn't a big smile, but it was real. Daniel extended his hand, not formally, not as a gesture for others, but simply for her. Annie looked at it. Then after the smallest pause, she placed her hand in his, and this time she didn't let go. Annie's hand was still in Daniel's when they stepped out into the hallway. The classroom door closed behind them with a soft final sound. And for a moment, Annie stood very still, as if she expected someone to call her back, to tell her she had misunderstood something, to return to the small desk by the window and finish proving herself again. No one did. The hallway felt different from the classroom. Wider, quieter, but not entirely safe yet. Annie's fingers tightened slightly around Daniel's hand, just enough for him to notice. He looked down at her. You okay? Annie nodded, but it was the kind of nod children give when they are still sorting through something too big to name. I think so. Daniel didn't press. He had learned that about her early. Annie did not open up when she was pushed. She opened up when she felt steady enough to do it on her own. Principal Howard walked a few steps ahead, speaking into his phone in a low voice. Yes, I need Mrs. Green available immediately. No, not later now. He paused, listening, then added. And have someone prepare a temporary schedule adjustment. He hung up and turned back to them, smoothing his tie again. We'll move Annie into another classroom for the remainder of the day. Mrs. Green is one of our most experienced lower school teachers. Very patient, very supportive. Daniel gave a small nod but said nothing. Howard hesitated. This is a temporary arrangement, of course, until we complete our internal review. Daniel's voice was calm. It's permanent. Howard blinked. Excuse me, she's not going back to that classroom. Howard shifted his weight. We should wait until we've completed a full evaluation before making that decision. Daniel looked at him. I already have. There was no anger in the statement, just certainty. Howard let out a slow breath. All right, for now, we'll proceed with the transfer. They reached the end of the hallway where a door stood slightly ajar. A soft voice could be heard inside, reading something aloud, gentle, steady, unhurried. Howard knocked lightly and opened the door. Mrs. Green. The voice stopped. A woman in her late 50s looked up from a small rocking chair at the front of the room. She wore a simple cardigan and glasses that rested low on her nose. Around her, a group of children sat on a rug, listening quietly. Yes, Richard. Howard stepped in. I need your help. This is Annie. She'll be joining your class today. Mrs. Green looked at Annie, really looked at her, not the way Mrs. Collins had measuring and assessing, but the way someone looks when they are trying to understand who a child is, not what she represents. Well, Mrs. Green said gently, we're always happy to have one more thinker in the room. Annie hesitated in the doorway. Daniel felt it, the slight pause, the uncertainty. He crouched down beside her, bringing himself to her level. You don't have to prove anything in there, he said quietly. Just be you. Annie looked at him. Okay. She let go of his hand, but only after a small squeeze. That squeeze stayed with him as she stepped into the classroom. Mrs. Green gestured toward the rug. Come sit with us. We're just finishing a story. Annie moved carefully, aware of the eyes on her, but they were not the same kind of eyes as before. Curious, yes, but not waiting for her to fail. She sat near the edge of the group. Mrs. Green smiled. Where were we? A boy raised his hand eagerly. The part where the fox figures out the trick. Ah, yes, Mrs. Green said, the part where thinking matters more than strength. Annie's shoulders lowered just a little. Back in the hallway, Daniel stood slowly. Howard cleared his throat. She'll be well taken care of here, Daniel nodded. She should have been from the beginning. Howard didn't argue. Instead, he gestured down the hallway. Let's continue this conversation in my office. Daniel followed his steps measured. The office was everything one would expect from a school-like street. Mary. Dark wood desk, neatly arranged folders, framed certificates, a photograph of Howard shaking hands with a local senator. The room smelled faintly of leather and coffee. Howard closed the door behind them. I've already contacted the board, he said. We'll be reviewing the situation immediately. Daniel remained standing. Not reviewing the situation. Investigating the conduct, Howard nodded. Yes, of course. Daniel's gaze moved across the room, taking in the carefully curated image of authority. How long has Mrs. Collins been teaching here? 23 years, and in that time, no one has ever raised a concern. Howard hesitated. Not formally, informally. Another pause. There have been comments. Nothing substantiated. Daniel turned back to him. What kind of comments? Howard shifted uncomfortably. Concerns about tone, expectations, differences in how certain students are challenged. Certain students, Daniel repeated. Howard didn't answer. Daniel didn't need him to. He walked to the window and looked out over the school grounds. Children were playing on the far side of the lawn. Their voices faint through the glass. It looked peaceful from a distance. It always did. When you ignore patterns, Daniel said quietly. You don't eliminate them, you protect them. Howard rubbed his forehead. We try to balance many factors. Parents, performance, reputation. Daniel turned sharply. And where does the child fit into that balance? Howard had no answer. Silence settled between them, heavier than before. After a moment, Daniel spoke again, calmer now. I want the footage from that classroom. I want a full report on Mrs. Collins' history with students. And I want a written explanation of your scholarship evaluation process. Howard nodded quickly. You'll have it. And one more thing. Howard straightened. Yes. Daniel met his eyes. You said earlier that Annie is not my concern. Howard's face tightened. That was a mistake, he said. Daniel held his gaze for a long second. Yes, he said, it was. He turned toward the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. For the record, Daniel added, his voice steady. She is my only concern. He opened the door and stepped out down the hall through the open doorway of Mrs. Green's classroom. He could see Annie sitting on the rug, listening to the story. She wasn't at the center. She wasn't being singled out. She was simply there. For the first time that morning, she looked like a child in a classroom. Not a test, not a question, not a problem someone was waiting to see fail, just a child. Daniel watched for a moment longer, then turned away, knowing that what had begun in that small classroom would not end there. Because some moments don't stay where they happen. They follow, and they demand to be answered. Mrs. Green's voice moved gently through the room, steady as a quiet stream, and Annie found herself listening without realizing when the tightness in her chest had begun to loosen. The story was simple. A fox, a trap, a clever way out. But the way Mrs. Green told it made every child feel as if thinking mattered, as if patience was something to be respected instead of rushed. Annie sat with her legs tucked beneath her, hands resting in her lap. No one had moved her to the corner. No one had given her a different task. No one had watched her like she was a question waiting to be answered wrong. For the first time that morning, she wasn't bracing. Why do you think the fox didn't panic? Mrs. Green asked, looking around the circle. A boy near Annie raised his hand. Because he knew panicking wouldn't help. Mrs. Green smiled. Exactly. Sometimes the hardest thing is to stay calm when everyone expects you to fall apart. Annie's fingers tightened slightly, just for a moment. Mrs. Green's eyes passed over her, not stopping, not pressing, simply including her like she included everyone else. That more than anything made Annie feel something unfamiliar, relief that didn't come with a condition. Meanwhile, down the hallway, Daniel stepped into a different kind of room. The conference room was larger than the principal's office, colder somehow, with a long polished table and chairs arranged with quiet precision. 2 members of the school board were already there along with a legal advisor Daniel recognized by reputation if not by name. Principal Howard stood near the head of the table, speaking in a low voice that stopped the moment Daniel entered. Mr. Whitaker, Howard said, attempting composure. Thank you for joining us so quickly. Daniel didn't respond to the tone. He took a seat without asking where he should sit. Let's begin, he said. There was no hostility in his voice. That made it more serious. One of the board members, an older man with silver hair and careful diction, folded his hands. We understand there was an incident in one of the lower school classrooms. Daniel looked at him. There wasn't an incident. The man blinked slightly. There was a pattern, Daniel continued. That happened to become visible in front of witnesses. The legal advisor leaned forward. Can you clarify what you observed? Daniel did not rush. He spoke the way he did in high-stakes negotiations, calm, precise, leaving no space for misinterpretation. A student was isolated from her peers, given a different and more difficult test without transparency, interrupted repeatedly while working, discouraged from completing the task, then publicly corrected when she identified an error in the material. He paused. No part of that is educational. The room remained still. Principal Howard shifted slightly. We are reviewing the teacher's conduct. Daniel turned his head toward him. You're reviewing whether what I described happened. Howard hesitated. No. Then what exactly are you reviewing? That question landed harder than expected. The silver-haired board member cleared his throat. We are determining the appropriate response. Daniel nodded once. Good. Then let's skip the part where we pretend there are multiple interpretations of what occurred. The legal advisor spoke carefully. Mr. Whitaker, we do need to consider all perspectives. Daniel's gaze moved to him. Then consider the child's. No one spoke for a moment because no one in that room had started there. Back in Mrs. Green's classroom, the story had ended and the children were now being handed small activity sheets, not tests, not evaluations, just simple exercises tied to the lesson. Mrs. Green walked over to Annie and knelt slightly beside her desk. Would you like to try this one or would you rather watch for a bit? Annie looked at the paper. It was not easy, but it was fair. That was the difference she felt immediately. I can try, Annie said. Mrs. Green nodded. Take your time. If something doesn't make sense, we'll figure it out together. No pressure, no warning, no hidden meaning, just together. Annie picked up her pencil. It felt different in her hand now. Not because the pencil had changed, because the room had a cross campus. In the conference room, the conversation had shifted into something more formal, but no less tense. We have policies in place to ensure equity, another board member said. A woman with sharp features and a voice that carried authority. If those policies were not followed, we will take corrective action. Daniel listened, then asked, how often are those policies enforced? The woman paused consistently. Daniel tilted his head slightly. Then today was an exception. No one answered immediately because the honest answer was not one they were prepared to give. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. Let me make this simple. I'm not interested in statements. I'm interested in outcomes. The legal advisor nodded slowly. What outcome are you seeking? Daniel's expression did not change. A full investigation. Immediate suspension pending review and a written commitment. That no student in this school will be treated differently based on assumptions about their background. Principal Howard inhaled sharply. Suspension is a significant step. Daniel looked at him. So is what she did. The room went quiet again. The silver-haired board member spoke more carefully now. We will need to follow due process. Of course, Daniel said, but process should not be used to delay accountability. There it was again. That word accountability, it seemed to settle differently in each person at the table. For some, it sounded like risk. For Daniel, it sounded like responsibility. In Mrs. Green's classroom, Annie worked through the problem slowly. She paused once, tapped her pencil lightly against the paper, then continued. No one interrupted her, no one leaned over her shoulder. No one laughed when she erased a number, and tried again. Grace would have liked this room, Annie thought. The idea came quietly without sadness this time, just a simple observation. Mrs. Green passed by again, glancing at Annie's work. That's a thoughtful approach, she said. Annie looked up. I'm checking it. Mrs. Green smiled. Good. Careful thinking is never something to rush. Annie nodded. No laughter followed. No correction, just acceptance. Back in the conference room, the meeting was reaching its turning point. We will place Mrs. Collins on immediate administrative leave pending investigation. The board member with sharp features said at last. Principal Howard looked at her surprised. That's appropriate, she finished. Daniel said nothing, but the slight shift in his posture made it clear he had heard what he needed to hear. The legal advisor added, we will also review classroom practices across the lower school to ensure compliance with our standards. Daniel nodded once. Good. The silver-haired man leaned forward. Mr. Whitaker, we value your support. We want to make this right. Daniel met his eyes. Then don't make it about me. He paused. Make it about the next child who sits at a desk like that. No one disagreed because no one could. The meeting ended without ceremony. Chairs moved. Papers were gathered. Words like follow-up and documentation were spoken in low voices. Daniel stood and left without waiting for anyone else. He walked back down the hallway, past the framed photographs, past the polished surfaces, past everything that had looked so perfect that morning. He stopped at the doorway of Mrs. Green's classroom. Inside, Annie was still working, still focused, still calm. He watched her for a moment. And this time, there was no tension in his shoulders because for now, she was safe. But as he turned to leave, one thought remained steady in his mind. Safety should never depend on who was watching. And before this was over, that was going to change. The school day did not return to normal. Even the children could feel it. In Mrs. Green's classroom, the lesson continued with the same gentle rhythm, but there was a quiet awareness beneath it now, like something important had happened just out of sight, and everyone was still adjusting to the echo of it. Annie remained on the rug with the others, her paper nearly finished. She checked her last answer once more, then placed her pencil down carefully. Mrs. Green noticed. All done. Annie nodded. Would you like to share how you got your answer? Annie hesitated just for a second. The memory of the board, the silence. Mrs. Collins' voice had all flickered through her mind. But Mrs. Green's expression didn't press her. It waited. Annie lifted her paper slightly. I counted the small ones first, she said. And then I checked if they fit into the bigger ones. Mrs. Green smiled. That's thoughtful work. That was all. No challenge hidden in the words. No test behind the compliment. Just acknowledgement. Annie felt something settle inside her again. This time a little deeper. Across the building, the news had already begun to move. Not loudly, not officially, but quickly. Teachers passing in the hallway spoke in lowered voices. A door closed a little more quietly than usual. Someone stopped mid-sentence when another adult walked by. The kind of subtle shift that meant something serious had happened, even if no one had announced it yet. In the faculty lounge, Mrs. Collins sat alone. Her hands were folded tightly in front of her. Fingers pressed together so hard the knuckles had turned pale. Her coffee had gone cold. She had not taken a sip. The door opened and another teacher stepped in. Then paused. I heard, the woman said softly. Mrs. Collins didn't look up. Then you heard wrong. The woman hesitated, then chose her words carefully. They're saying there's going to be a review. Mrs. Collins let out a short breath. Of course there is. She finally looked up, her eyes sharp now. One parent walks in, doesn't understand classroom dynamics, and suddenly we're all under investigation. The other teacher shifted uncomfortably. It wasn't just a parent. Mrs. Collins' expression hardened. I know who he is. Silence stretched between them. Then the woman said quietly, Margaret, you did give her a different test. Mrs. Collins stood abruptly. She's a scholarship candidate. She needed to be challenged. That's not what they're questioning. Mrs. Collins laughed, but it was brittle. Of course it is. That's always what it becomes. Standards are called unfair the moment someone doesn't like the outcome. The woman didn't respond because even she could hear the difference between standards and something else. Back in Mrs. Green's classroom, the morning was moving toward its close. The children were gathering their things, small backpacks being zipped, papers being stacked. Grace appeared at the doorway, hesitating as she looked inside. Mrs. Green noticed her. Yes, sweetheart. Grace stepped in slowly. Can I talk to Annie? Mrs. Green glanced at Annie, then nodded. Of course. Grace walked over, her steps quick but uncertain. Are you really staying in this class now? Annie shook her head. I don't know. Just today, I think. Grace frowned. It's better here. Annie gave a small nod. Yeah. Grace hesitated, then added. You didn't do anything wrong. Annie looked at her. I know, she said, but the way she said it was different than before. Before it had sounded like something she hoped was true. Now it sounded like something she was beginning to believe. Grace smiled a little. Good. Mrs. Green called the class to attention and Grace slipped back out, glancing once more over her shoulder before leaving. Annie watched her go, then picked up her bag. Outside, Daniel was speaking with the legal advisor near the front office. I'll have the documentation sent to you by the end of the day, the man was saying. Daniel nodded. Include prior complaints, even informal ones. The advisor hesitated. Those aren't always recorded. Daniel's gaze sharpened slightly. Then find the ones that should have been. The man gave a small nod. Understood. As he walked away, Principal Howard approached again, his posture more careful than before. We've informed Mrs. Collins of the administrative leave, he said. Daniel didn't react outwardly, and she was surprised. I imagine she was. Howard shifted his weight. There may be pushback. She has supporters. Daniel looked at him. That doesn't change what happened. No, Howard admitted. It doesn't. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Howard said more quietly. This school has a reputation. Daniel's expression remained steady. Then protect it the right way. Howard exhaled slowly. We're trying. Daniel didn't answer because trying wasn't the same as doing at that moment. Annie stepped into the hallway. She spotted Daniel immediately. Hi, she said. Daniel turned and something in his face softened. Hey, she walked over to him, holding her bag with both hands. Are we going home soon? He said. Just a few more minutes. Annie nodded. She glanced down the hallway, then back at him. Is my teacher in trouble? Daniel considered the question carefully. She's being held responsible, he said. Annie frowned slightly. Because of me? No, Daniel said gently. Because of what she did. Annie looked down at her hands. Daniel crouched slightly, bringing himself closer to her level again. Listen to me, he said quietly. You didn't cause this. You showed the truth. That's different. Annie nodded but slowly as if she were still learning how to carry that idea. Okay. Daniel stood again. Howard cleared his throat softly. We'll be in touch regarding the next steps. Daniel gave a brief nod. I expect that. He placed a hand lightly on Annie's shoulder. Let's go. They walked toward the exit together. The front doors opened, letting in the cool afternoon air. Outside, the world looked unchanged. Cars passing, leaves moving in the breeze, the ordinary rhythm of a day continuing. But Annie knew something had changed. Not everything, but something important. She looked up at Daniel as they reached the car. Did I really do everything right? Daniel opened the door for her, then paused. He met her eyes. Yes, he said. This time, there was no hesitation. Annie climbed into the car. As Daniel closed the door and walked around to the driver's side, the school stood behind them, quiet and composed, as if nothing had happened at all. But inside those walls, conversations had begun that would not be easily stopped. And somewhere in the building, a teacher who had once been certain of her authority was now being asked to explain it. Daniel started the engine. He didn't look back, but the story wasn't finished yet. Not even close. The drive home was quiet at first. Not the kind of silence that feels empty, but the kind that settles after something important has been said, even if no one has spoken it out loud yet. The city moved around them in its usual rhythm. Cars stopping at lights, people crossing streets, a man walking a dog along the sidewalk, but inside the car, time felt slower. Annie sat in the passenger seat, her backpack resting against her knees. She traced the edge of the zipper with her finger, not opening it, just feeling the shape of it, as if the small familiar motion might help her sort through everything that had happened. Daniel kept his eyes on the road, but he was aware of every small movement she made. After a few minutes, Annie spoke. Are you mad? Daniel glanced at her briefly, then back at the road. At you, she nodded. No, he said, not even a little. Annie looked down again. You stood up. I did. You never do that at school. There was no accusation in her voice, just observation. Daniel allowed himself a small breath. You're right. I usually don't. Why today? The question lingered. Daniel slowed the car as the light ahead turned red. He rested his hands lightly on the steering wheel. Considering how much to say, how much she needed, how much she could carry because today, he said, someone needed me too. Annie was quiet for a moment. Me, yes. She didn't respond right away. The light turned green. The car moved forward again. I thought maybe I did something wrong, she said softly. Daniel shook his head. You didn't, but she said, I know what she said. Daniel interrupted gently, and I know what you did. Annie looked at him. You stayed calm, he continued. You finished your work. You told the truth. That's not wrong. That's exactly what you're supposed to do. Annie's fingers tightened slightly, around the edge of her backpack. Then why did it feel like it was wrong? Daniel didn't answer immediately, because that was the harder question. They drove another block before he spoke again. Sometimes, he said carefully, people don't like being corrected, especially when they think they're in charge. Annie frowned a little, even if they're wrong. Especially then, that answer seemed to stay with her. She looked out the window, watching the trees pass by, their leaves shifting in the wind. That's not fair. No, Daniel said quietly. It isn't. The car turned into a quieter neighborhood, the streets wider, the houses set back behind trimmed hedges and long driveways. Annie had seen these streets every day, but today they felt different somehow, as if she were noticing them more clearly. Are they going to fix it? She asked. Daniel's grip on the wheel tightened just slightly. They're going to try. Annie turned back to him. Is trying enough? Daniel almost smiled. That depends on what they do next. They pulled into the driveway. The house stood calm and still, sunlight resting across the front steps. It was a place Annie knew well. The smell of the kitchen, the quiet of her room, the way the floors sounded different in the morning than at night. It was safe in a way the classroom had not been. Daniel turned off the engine. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Annie said, Can I show you something? Daniel looked at her. Of course. She opened her backpack and pulled out the test. The pages were slightly bent now, the edges soft from being handled. The pencil marks were still clear, the small eraser smudges visible where she had checked her work. She held it out to him. I finished it, she said. All of it except the last one. Daniel took the paper, not to check it, but to see it the way she had held it. The careful writing, the patience in each step, the quiet determination pressed into every line. I know you did, he said. Annie watched his face. Do you want to see how I did the square one? Daniel nodded. I do. They stepped out of the car together. Inside, the house felt warmer than the afternoon outside. Annie set her bag down and walked straight to the kitchen table, spreading the test out in front of her. Daniel followed, placing his keys on the counter without looking at them. Annie pointed to one of the problems. This one, she said. I counted the small ones first, but then I thought maybe I missed some, so I checked again. Daniel pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. That's called verifying your work. Annie looked up. Is that good? It's more than good, he said. It's how people make sure they're right. Annie nodded slowly. She pointed to another problem. And this one, I almost got it wrong. But then I saw that the pattern changed. Daniel leaned forward slightly, listening. As she explained, her voice grew steadier. The hesitation from the classroom faded, replaced by something more natural. This was where Annie felt strongest. Not in defending herself, but in understanding. When she reached the last page, her finger stopped. This one, she said quietly. It doesn't work. Daniel nodded. I know. Annie looked at the numbers again. I thought maybe I missed something, so I tried it 3 times. Daniel watched her carefully. And what happened? It was still wrong. Daniel leaned back slightly. Then it wasn't you. Annie exhaled softly. That seemed to matter. They sat in silence for a moment. The test spread between them, the afternoon light shifting slowly across the table. Then Annie asked, why didn't you tell them right away? Daniel met her eyes. That you're my dad. The question hung there. Daniel didn't look away. Because I wanted to know how they would treat you. Annie thought about that. And now you know. Yes. She looked back at the test. Would it be different if they knew before? Daniel didn't answer immediately. Yes, he said finally. Annie's brow furrowed. Then why didn't you tell them? Daniel rested his hands on the table. Because it shouldn't have to be different. Annie sat with that. Children understand fairness more clearly than adults sometimes. They don't complicate it. They don't negotiate it. They feel it. That's not fair, she said again. No, Daniel agreed. It's not. The kitchen grew quiet again. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked. Softly. Outside, a car passed, the sound fading quickly. Annie folded the test carefully, smoothing the edges as she did. Am I still on the scholarship list? She asked. Daniel looked at her. Yes, he said, but not because of them. Annie tilted her head. Then because of who? Daniel reached across the table and tapped the folded paper lightly. Because of you. Annie didn't smile. Not right away, but something in her expression changed. Something steadier, something that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. She picked up her pencil again, turning it in her fingers, feeling the small marks where she had bitten it earlier. Then she said, almost to herself, I knew it didn't work. Daniel leaned back in his chair. I know you did, and this time there was no one there to question it. That evening, the house did not return to its usual rhythm. Dinner was made, plates were set, the familiar routine unfolded the way it always did. Quiet, orderly, almost comforting in its predictability, but something underneath it had shifted, like a piece of furniture moved just enough that you noticed it every time you walked past. Annie sat at the kitchen table, her feet tucked under the chair, slowly pushing a piece of chicken across her plate. She wasn't refusing to eat. She just wasn't hungry in the way she usually was. Her thoughts were somewhere else. Still circling the classroom, the board. The moment when everything had gone still, Daniel noticed. He always did. You don't have to finish everything, he said gently, cutting into his own food, but not really eating it. Annie looked up. I'm trying. I know. She took a small bite, then set her fork down again. After a moment, she asked, are they talking about it right now? Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. Yes, at school, yes. Annie frowned. About me. Daniel considered the question carefully. About what happened, he said, not about you. She seemed to think about that, turning it over in her mind the way she had turned over the numbers on her test. But it was me, she said. It involved you, Daniel corrected gently. That's different. Annie wasn't fully convinced, but she let the thought rest for now. What are they saying? She asked. Daniel reached for his glass of water. More to give himself a second than because he needed it. Some people are trying to understand. Some people are trying to explain it. And some people are trying to make sure it doesn't happen again. Annie's eyes lifted slightly at that. Will it? Daniel met her gaze. Not if I can help it. That answer settled something in her. She picked up her fork again and took another bite. This time without hesitation. Across the city, the school building was no longer quiet. In a second-floor office, 3 members of the board sat around a table covered in printed reports, emails, and hastily gathered notes. The atmosphere had changed from controlled to urgent. What had started as an internal matter had already begun to spread beyond the walls of St. Mary. They've requested the footage, the legal advisor said, tapping a folder lightly, not just from today, from prior observations as well. The woman with sharp features leaned back in her chair. How far back? As far as we can provide. Principal Howard stood near the window looking out at the darkened campus. We need to be careful. Context matters. Context doesn't change what's on the recording, the advisor replied. Howard turned. It changes how it's interpreted. The silver-haired board member spoke quietly. We're not in a position to reinterpret this. Howard's jaw tightened. We can't let one incident define the school. It won't, the man said. But how we respond to it will. Silence followed. No one disagreed. In another part of the building, Mrs. Collins sat in her car, parked in the far corner of the empty lot. The engine was off. The lights were dark. She had not gone home yet. Her hands rested on the steering wheel, unmoving. For 23 years, she had walked into that school with certainty. She knew the routines, the expectations, the boundaries. She had managed classrooms, guided students, shaped outcomes. She had believed, truly believed that she understood what it meant to maintain standards. And now, for the first time, someone had stood in front of her and said clearly and without apology that what she had done was wrong. Not mistaken, wrong. She exhaled slowly. They don't understand, she murmured to herself. But the words didn't sound as solid as they had earlier because a part of her, quiet and unwelcome, had begun to ask a different question. What if they did? Back at the house, Annie had finished dinner and was sitting on the living room floor, her legs crossed, her test spread out in front of her again. The lamp beside the couch cast a soft glow over the pages, making the pencil marks look darker than they had in the classroom. Daniel sat nearby, not reading, not working, just present. Annie traced one of the problems with her finger. I keep thinking about it, she said. About what? The last one. Daniel smiled slightly. The impossible one. Annie nodded. I tried it again, and it's still wrong. Daniel leaned back. Then it's consistent. Annie looked at him. Is that a good thing? It means your reasoning is solid. She considered that, then asked, do adults ever get things wrong and not want to say it? Daniel let out a quiet breath. Yes. Why? Because admitting you're wrong can feel like losing something. Annie frowned. Like what? Daniel thought for a moment. Control, pride, sometimes even respect. Annie tilted her head. But wouldn't you get more respect if you told the truth? Daniel smiled. But it was a thoughtful smile, not an easy one. You would think so. Annie looked back at the paper. I would. That answer stayed with him. The simplicity of it, the clarity. She wasn't trying to win anything. She wasn't trying to protect anything. She was just trying to understand what was true. And that more than anything, was what had made the morning so uncomfortable for the adults in that room. Because truth, when spoken simply, leaves very little room to hide. The phone on the table buzzed. Daniel glanced at it, then picked it up. A message from the legal advisor. Footage secured. Preliminary review confirms your account. Additional findings pending. Daniel read it once, then set the phone down. Annie looked up. What is it? Work, he said. Good work or bad work? Daniel considered that. Important work. Annie nodded, satisfied with the answer. She gathered the pages of her test and stacked them neatly. Can I keep this? She asked. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Why would you want to? Annie shrugged slightly. Because I finished it, Daniel Smith. Then you should keep it. She slid the pages into a folder and set it beside her as if placing something valuable where it belonged. Outside, the night settled quietly over the city. Inside the school, conversations continued, decisions forming, positions shifting, and in a small living room. A child who had been asked to prove herself that morning had already done something far more difficult. She had told the truth, and for the first time she was beginning to understand that the problem had never been her ability to solve the question. It had been whether the adults in the room were willing to accept the answer. The house was quiet long after Annie went to bed. Not the soft quiet of a routine evening, but the kind that comes when the day has left something unfinished behind it. The lights in the living room were dim, the kitchen clean, the test Annie had carefully folded now resting on the edge of the table where she had left it, as if it still mattered enough to keep within reach. Daniel stood by the window, looking out into the dark, his phone rested in his hand, the earlier message still fresh in his mind. Footage secured. Preliminary review confirms your account. Additional findings pending. It should have felt like progress. It didn't, because confirmation was not the same as resolution. Behind him, the house made its quiet nighttime sounds. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant tick of the clock, the faint shift of pipes adjusting to cooling air. Ordinary sounds, safe sounds. Daniel placed the phone down and walked slowly back to the table. Annie's test was still there. He unfolded it page by page. He looked at it again, not as evidence this time, but as a record of something more personal. The careful writing, the erased lines, the small, deliberate corrections. It wasn't just correct, it was thoughtful, and that was what made everything else harder to ignore. He reached the last page, the impossible question. 24 apples, 5 groups, each odd. He stared at it for a long moment. Then he sat down. Across the city, in a quiet office lit only by a desk lamp, the legal advisor replayed the classroom footage again on the screen. The scene unfolded exactly as it had that morning. The seating arrangement, the different test, the interruptions, the laughter, the moment Annie raised her hand and was ignored, the moment she spoke, the moment the room went silent. The advisor paused the video at that point, leaning back in his chair. There was no ambiguity, no missing context that could soften what had happened. He reached for his phone and dialed. Daniel, he said when the call connected. I've reviewed everything. Daniel leaned back in his chair. The test still open in front of him. And there's no way to defend it, the advisor said plainly. Not professionally, not legally, not ethically. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. What about prior incidents? There was a pause on the other end. There are patterns, the advisor admitted. Nothing formally escalated before, but enough to establish behavior. Daniel opened his eyes again. How long? Years. That word settled heavily. Daniel looked back at the test. Years. Not a mistake. Assist them. What happens next? He asked. The board is preparing a formal statement. They'll move quickly now. They have to. Daniel nodded slightly, though the advisor couldn't see it. And Mrs. Collins, administrative leave is already in effect. Suspension is likely, possibly termination, depending on the findings. Daniel's gaze didn't move from the paper. It shouldn't depend. I know, the advisor said quietly. But it will. Another silence. Then the advisor added, there's something else. Daniel waited. The footage is already being discussed outside the board. Daniel's expression hardened slightly. How far outside? Parents, staff, possibly more by morning. Daniel exhaled slowly. Then they've lost control of it. Yes. The call ended shortly after. Daniel sat there for a while, the phone still in his hand. Control. That had been the word used earlier, and now it was gone. Upstairs, Annie shifted in her sleep. Her room was dim, the soft glow of a nightlight casting a gentle circle on the wall. The stuffed bear rested beside her pillow, one ear slightly bent. The red ribbon faded but still tied. Her brow furrowed slightly as if her mind had not fully let go of the day. In her dream, the classroom returned. The board, the silence, the feeling of standing alone while everyone watched. But then something changed. Not the room, not the teacher, just one thing. This time when she spoke, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt clear, like the moment before someone finally listens. Downstairs, Daniel folded the test carefully and placed it back on the table. He turned off the lights and moved through the house, checking doors, turning down lamps, the small routines that grounded everything else. When he reached the stairs, he paused. Then he turned and walked quietly up. He stopped at Annie's door and pushed it open just enough to look inside. She was asleep, peaceful, mostly. The tension from earlier softened by the quiet of night, though not completely gone. Daniel stepped inside, careful not to make a sound. He adjusted the blanket slightly where it had slipped from her shoulder. Annie stirred just a little. Dad, she murmured, not fully awake. Daniel froze for a second. She hadn't called him that at school, but here in the quiet, in the dark, where nothing had to be hidden. Yeah, he said softly. Annie's eyes didn't open. Did I fix it? The question was barely more than a whisper. Daniel knelt beside the bed. Yes, he said. You did. Annie's breathing slowed again, but before she drifted completely back to sleep, she added almost without thinking. Then why did it feel like I broke something? Daniel didn't answer right away. Because she had, just not what she thought. You didn't break anything, he said quietly. He paused. You showed something that was already broken. Annie didn't respond. She was asleep again, but the words stayed in the room. Daniel sat there for a moment longer, then stood and walked to the door. Before leaving, he looked back once more at the small figure in the bed, at the quiet strength that had carried her through the day, at the truth she had spoken without knowing how much it would cost. He turned off the light and closed the door gently behind him. Downstairs, the house settled fully into silence. Outside the night stretched on, and somewhere beyond it, decisions were already forming faster now, sharper, harder to contain. Because what had happened in that classroom was no longer just a private matter. It was becoming something larger, something that would not stay quiet. And by morning, the question would no longer be whether Annie had been right. It would be who was willing to stand with her. The morning did not wait for anyone to be ready. By the time the sun rose over St. Mary Preparatory Academy, the quiet conversations from the night before had already turned into something sharper, more defined. Emails had been sent, messages forwarded, screenshots shared. What had happened in one classroom had begun to move through the school like a current, unseen, but impossible to ignore. Daniel was already awake when the first message came through. He stood in the kitchen, coffee untouched, the early light stretching across the counter. His phone vibrated once, then again. He picked it up, a forwarded email from the board. Subject: urgent, internal review findings. He opened it. Preliminary review confirms inappropriate differential treatment of a student during observed instruction. Administrative leave for Mrs. Collins is effective immediately. Further disciplinary action pending full investigation. Daniel read it once, then again. It was formal, careful, measured in tone, but it was also clear. The truth had moved from private acknowledgement to official record. Another message followed, this one from the legal advisor. Media inquiry likely by midday. Recommend statement preparation. Daniel exhaled slowly. There it was, the shift from internal matter to public accountability. Upstairs, Annie's alarm clock clicked softly as it reached the hour. The gentle chime filled her room, but she didn't move right away. For a few seconds, she lay still, staring at the ceiling, as if deciding whether the day was real or something she could stay away from if she didn't get up. Then she sat up. The memory came back quickly. The classroom, the test, the silence, Daniel standing, her stomach tightened slightly. She got out of bed anyway. Downstairs, Daniel heard her footsteps before he saw her. He set his phone aside and turned just as she entered the kitchen, her hair slightly uneven from sleep, her expression quieter than usual. "Morning," he said. "Morning," Annie replied. She climbed into her chair at the table, pulling her knees in slightly, the way she did when she wasn't sure what the day would ask of her. Daniel placed a glass of orange juice in front of her. "How are you feeling?" Annie shrugged. "Okay." It wasn't a full answer, but it wasn't avoidance either. Daniel nodded. "That's enough for now." She took a sip of juice, then looked at him. "Do I have to go back today?" The question was simple, but it carried everything underneath it. Daniel didn't hesitate. "No." Annie blinked. "I don't." "No," he said again. "You're staying home today." A small shift in her shoulders. Relief. "Okay," she said quietly. Daniel leaned against the counter. "We'll figure out what comes next." "Together." Annie nodded. "Together." That word mattered. She reached for a piece of toast, breaking it slowly, her thoughts still moving. After a moment, she asked, "Are they still talking about it?" Daniel gave a small, honest nod. "Yes." Annie looked down at the table. "At school and outside of it." She frowned slightly. "Why outside?" Daniel paused. Because that answer was more complicated because sometimes he said carefully when something unfair happens people want to understand it and when they understand it they don't want it to happen again. Annie considered that so they tell other people. Yes, she looked up. Is that good or bad? Daniel thought about it. Depends on what they do with it. Annie nodded slowly. She didn't ask more yet. Across town the school was already under pressure. In the main office, phones rang more often than usual. Emails continued to arrive. Not just from parents, but from alumni, donors, even community members who had heard fragments of the story and were now asking questions the school could not easily answer. Principal Howard stood behind his desk reading a printed copy of the official statement. "We are committed to maintaining an equitable learning environment for all students." He lowered the paper. The words felt thin compared to what had actually happened. A knock at the door. "Come in." The legal advisor stepped inside. "It's moving faster than expected." Howard exhaled. "How bad?" "Local outlets have picked it up. Nothing detailed yet, but they're asking questions." Howard closed his eyes briefly. "And the board meeting again at noon." Howard nodded. There was a time when he believed reputation was something you protected by controlling information. Now he was beginning to understand it was something else entirely. It was what remained after the truth was known. Back at the house, Annie had finished her breakfast and was sitting on the floor again, her test beside her. She wasn't studying at this time, just keeping it close. Daniel sat nearby, reviewing notes on his phone, but his attention shifted the moment Annie spoke. "Can I ask you something?" "Always." Annie hesitated. "Are they mad at me?" Daniel set the phone down. "No, but what if they are?" He leaned forward slightly. "Then they're wrong." Annie looked at him. Even if they're grown-ups, Daniel's expression didn't change. Especially then, that answer stayed with her. She picked up the test, flipping to the last page again. The impossible question. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she said, "I don't think I'm scared of it anymore." Daniel watched her carefully. "Of the problem?" Annie shook her head of saying it's wrong. Daniel nodded slowly. "That's important." Annie looked up at him. "Why?" "Because he said there are going to be more moments like that. Not the same, but similar." She frowned slightly. "Where people don't want to hear it." "Yes." Annie thought about that. "Do I always have to say it?" Daniel didn't answer right away. "No," he said finally. "But when you do, you should know why." Annie tilted her head. "Why did I say it yesterday?" Daniel met her eyes. "Because it mattered to you." Annie looked back at the paper. Then she nodded. Outside, the morning continued. Inside the school, pressure built. And in a quiet house, a child who had once questioned whether she had done something wrong was beginning to understand something far more powerful. That being right was not always the hard part. Standing by it was, and the world was about to show her exactly what that meant. By midday, the story no longer belonged to the school. It had moved beyond emails and quiet conversations, beyond the careful language of board meetings and internal reviews. It had crossed into the open, where questions did not wait for permission, and answers could not be shaped as easily. Daniel stood in his home office, the television muted, but alive with motion. A local news segment played silently across the screen footage of the school building. A still image of a classroom door. a scrolling headline that read, "Private Academy Under Scrutiny After Classroom Incident." He did not turn up the volume. He didn't need to. His phone had already told him everything. Another message came in. Statement released. Media requesting comment from you directly. He read it once, then set the phone down. Behind him, Annie's voice drifted faintly from the living room. She was speaking to herself softly, the way she did when she was thinking through something. Not worried, not upset, just processing. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. This was the part he had always wanted to protect her from. Not the unfair moment itself, because life would bring those no matter what he did, but the part where the world turned that moment into something larger, something louder, something that did not always understand the child at the center of it. He turned off the television. Silence returned to the room. In the living room, Annie sat on the floor with a notebook open in front of her. The test lay beside it, but she wasn't looking at it now. Instead, she was writing something. Slowly, carefully, pressing the pencil just a little too hard into the page. Daniel stepped into the doorway. "What are you working on?" he asked. Annie looked up. "I'm trying to fix it." He walked closer. "The problem?" She nodded. "I know it's wrong, but I keep thinking, what if it wasn't?" Daniel sat down across from her. "What do you mean?" Annie turned the notebook toward him. She had rewritten the question at the top of the page. 24 apples, 5 groups, each group odd. Below it, she had started testing different combinations again, even though she already knew the outcome. "I was thinking maybe if one group was different," she said, "or if the numbers changed a little." Daniel watched her for a moment. "You're trying to make it fair," he said. Annie paused, then nodded. "Yeah." Daniel leaned back slightly. "But the question wasn't written to be fair." Annie frowned. "Then why write it like that?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "people don't check their work the way they expect others to." Annie looked at him. "That's not a good rule," she said. "No," Daniel agreed. "It isn't." She looked back at the notebook. "I don't like it," she said. "The question." Annie shook her head. "The way it felt." Daniel understood. That was the part that stayed. Not just what happened, but how it felt while it was happening. Before he could respond, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen, then answered. "Yes, Then the legal advisor's voice came through. More urgent than before. "It's escalated." Daniel stood slowly. "How far?" "National outlets are picking it up. They're framing it as a broader issue. Bias in private education, unequal treatment, systemic concerns." Daniel's expression didn't change, but something in his posture tightened. "And the school?" he asked. "They've released a statement. It's careful, non-specific. They're trying to contain it." Daniel walked toward the window. "They can't," he said. "I know." Another pause. "They're also asking if you'll make a statement," the advisor added. "They believe your voice will shape the narrative." Daniel looked out at the street where everything still appeared normal. "What narrative?" he asked quietly. "The one that decides whether this becomes a single incident," the advisor said, "or something bigger." Daniel didn't respond right away because he already knew the answer. When the call ended, he remained by the window for a moment longer. Behind him, Annie had gone quiet. "Is everything okay?" she asked. Daniel turned back to her. He didn't hide it. "People are talking about what happened," he said. Annie tilted her head like before, more than before. She looked at the notebook, then at him. "Are they saying it right?" Daniel walked back and sat down again. "Some are," he said. "Some aren't." Annie considered that. "Can you tell them?" Daniel studied her face. "What would you want me to say?" Annie didn't answer immediately. She picked up her pencil again, tapping it lightly against the page. Then she said that it wasn't just about the math. Daniel felt that land because she was right. It never had been. He nodded slowly. "Okay." Annie looked up. "Will they listen?" Daniel held her gaze. "Some will." She seemed to accept that. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. Across the city, the school was no longer trying to stay quiet. In the conference room, the board sat together again. This time with urgency, replacing caution. "We need to get ahead of this," one member said. "The longer we wait, the worse it looks." "It already looks bad," another replied. Principal Howard sat at the end of the table, his earlier confidence gone. "What about the student?" someone asked. "Is she going to return?" Howard hesitated. "We don't know yet. That needs to be addressed." "And the teacher?" another voice added. "Suspension is confirmed," the legal advisor said. "Termination is under review." Silence followed. Then the silver-haired board member spoke. "This isn't just about one teacher anymore." No one disagreed because by now they all understood. The moment in that classroom had opened something and it wasn't going to close easily. Back in the house, Annie had stopped writing. She closed the notebook and placed it beside the test. Then she looked at Daniel. "I don't think I can fix it," she said. Daniel nodded. "You're not supposed to." Annie frowned slightly. Then who is? Daniel met her eyes. The people who made it wrong in the first place. Annie sat with that. Then she asked, will they? Daniel didn't answer right away because that question didn't have a simple answer. Some will try, he said. Annie nodded slowly. Then she reached over and closed the test folder completely, pressing it flat with both hands. I already did my part, she said. Daniel looked at her. Yes, he said. You did. Outside, the world kept moving. Inside, the story kept growing. And for the first time, Annie was no longer just part of it. She understood it, not fully, but enough to know that the problem had never been hers to solve alone. By late afternoon, the story had found its voice. Not one voice, many different tones, different angles, different intentions, but all circling the same moment. A classroom, a child, a question that didn't make sense, and the silence that followed when she said so. Daniel sat at the long table in his office, a blank document open in front of him. The cursor blinked steadily on the screen waiting. He had written statements before for investors, for partners, for moments when clarity mattered. But this felt different because this wasn't about protecting a company. It was about protecting the truth without turning Annie into a headline. His phone buzzed again. Another message from the legal advisor. They're quoting parents now, some defending the school, some raising concerns about bias. Narrative is splitting. Daniel read it, then set the phone down. Splitting. That was expected because truth rarely arrives in a straight line when people have something to lose. Behind him, the house remained quiet. Annie had moved to her room after lunch, saying she wanted to think for a bit. He hadn't followed. He knew that kind of thinking. It wasn't something that needed interruption. Still, he listened for footsteps, for movement, for anything that told him she was okay. After a moment, he stood and walked down the hall. Her door was slightly open. Inside, Annie sat on the floor, her notebook open again. But this time, she wasn't writing numbers. She was drawing. Daniel leaned lightly against the door frame. What are you working on now? Annie didn't look up right away. A picture of what? She turned the notebook slightly so he could see. It was the classroom. Simple lines, small desks, a board at the front, and in the corner, a single desk by a window. Daniel's chest tightened. You drew where you were sitting, he said. Annie nodded. Then she added something else to the drawing. A small figure standing near that desk. Not alone this time. Daniel stepped into the room. Who's that? He asked. Annie looked at it. That's when you stood up, she said. Daniel sat down across from her. You remember it like that? Annie shrugged slightly. It felt different after that. Different. That word carried more than she said. Daniel nodded slowly. Yeah, it did. Annie looked at the drawing again. Then she erased something carefully. The single desk. When she was done, she read through the desks in a group. Together, Daniel watched her to it. You changed it, he said. Annie nodded. That's how it should be. Daniel didn't respond right away because she had just done something adults often failed to do. She had not only seen the problem, she had imagined the correction. Back in his office, the cursor still blinked. Waiting, Daniel returned to the chair and sat down. He placed his hands on the table for a moment, then began to type. Not as a businessman, not as a donor, as a father. The words came slowly at first, then more clearly. This is not a story about a difficult question. It is a story about how we respond when a child tells us the truth. He paused, read it again, then continued. A student was given a problem that could not be solved as written. She did what we ask all students to do. She worked carefully, checked her reasoning, and spoke up when something didn't make sense. What followed should concern all of us. He stopped again because now the line had been drawn. This was no longer about describing what happened. It was about defining what it meant. Across the city, the school was preparing its own response. In the conference room, the board sat in front of a revised statement. We need to acknowledge more, one member said. This isn't enough. It's too vague. Another agreed. It sounds like we're avoiding responsibility. Principal Howard looked exhausted. We are taking responsibility, he said. We placed her on leave. That's a step, the silver-haired member replied. Not a resolution. The room fell quiet. Then the woman with sharp features spoke again. What concerns me, she said, is not just what happened. It's how long it was allowed to happen without being addressed. No one argued because now they were asking the harder question. Not what, but why. Back at the house, Annie had finished her drawing. She closed the notebook and held it in her lap. For a moment, she just sat there. Then she stood and walked down the hall. Daniel looked up as she entered the office. I finished it, she said. The drawing. Annie nodded. She walked over and placed the notebook on the table. Daniel turned it toward himself. The desks were no longer separated. The room looked different, not because the walls had changed, but because the way she saw it had Daniel looked at her. This is better, he said. Annie gave a small nod. Yeah, she glanced at the computer screen. What are you writing? Daniel hesitated for just a second. Then he said something to help people understand. Annie tilted her head about yesterday. Yes, she thought about that then asked, are you going to tell them everything? Daniel met her eyes. No, he said, just what matters. Annie seemed to consider that. Then she pointed to the screen. Make sure you tell them she wasn't trying to be bad. Daniel paused. Who? Me. The words were simple, but they carried something deeper. Not fear, not doubt, just a quiet need to be seen clearly. Daniel nodded. I will. Annie gave a small breath, almost like relief. Then she turned and walked back toward her room. Daniel watched her go. Then he turned back to the screen and added one more line. She was not being difficult. She was being honest, and there is a difference we must learn to recognize. He read it once, then saved the document. Outside, the conversation continued to grow. Inside, something had already become clear. This was no longer just about correcting a mistake. It was about deciding what kind of truth people were willing to stand behind. And for Annie, that answer was already simple. She had never been afraid of the problem, only of whether anyone would listen when she solved it. The statement was released just before sunset. It did not arrive quietly. By the time Daniel pressed send, the message had already been reviewed, refined, and anticipated. But the moment it entered the world, it stopped belonging to him alone. It moved outward, shared, quoted, debated, carrying with it not just his words, but the weight of everything that had led to them. Inside the house, the air remained still. Annie sat on the living room floor again, her notebook beside her, the drawing closed now, but not forgotten. She wasn't watching the news. She wasn't reading messages. She was building something small with wooden blocks, stacking them carefully, testing their balance, adjusting when one leaned too far. Daniel stood near the doorway, watching her for a moment before speaking. It's out, he said. Annie looked up. The thing you wrote? Yes. She nodded once as if that answered everything she needed for now. Okay. She placed another block on top of the stack, then paused, watching to see if it would hold. It did. Across the city, the reaction came quickly. Daniel's statement moved through news outlets, social media, and parent networks with a clarity that made it difficult to ignore. Some responded with support, calling it necessary, overdue, honest. Others pushed back, defending the school, the teacher, the idea that standards should not be questioned so easily. But beneath all of it, one part of the statement stayed with people. She was not being difficult. She was being honest. That line appeared again and again. Quoted, repeated, considered at St. Mary. The board gathered once more. This time not to debate what had happened, but to decide what would follow it. The room felt different now, less controlled, more accountable. Principal Howard sat at the table, his posture quieter than it had been days before. The silver-haired board member spoke first. We need to finalize this. No one asked what he meant. They all knew. The legal advisor placed a document on the table. Termination, he said simply. Effective immediately. Statement to follow. A silence settled, not uncertain, just final. The woman with sharp features nodded slowly. And the broader review already underway, he replied. Classroom practices, evaluation methods, reporting procedures. Howard exhaled. It should have happened sooner. No one disagreed because that more than anything else had become the truth they could not avoid. Back at the house, Annie's tower had grown taller. She leaned slightly to one side, examining it, then adjusted one piece at the base. Daniel walked over and sat down nearby. That's a good structure, he said. Annie smiled just a little. I had to fix it twice. Daniel nodded. That's how you know it's strong. She looked at the blocks, then at him. Did they fix it, too? Daniel didn't answer immediately. They're starting to, he said. Annie tilted her head. Does that mean it's done? No, Daniel replied. It means they're responsible for finishing it. Annie considered that. Then she added another block. Carefully. It's easier when you can see where it's wrong, she said. Daniel watched her. Yes, he said. It is. She looked up at him. Why didn't they see it before? Daniel leaned back slightly, resting his hands on the floor behind him. Sometimes, he said, people get used to things being a certain way. Even if that way isn't fair, Annie frowned. But it was always wrong. Yes, then why not fix it earlier? Daniel looked at her because no one made them look closely enough. Annie thought about that, then she said very simply, I did. Daniel felt something steady in that. You did. There was no need to add anything else because she understood. Not everything but enough. The evening settled slowly. The noise outside continued, messages, responses, conversations, but inside the house held its quiet again. Later, Annie sat at the kitchen table, the test folder in front of her. She opened it one more time, not to check her answers, not to prove anything, just to look. Her eyes moved across the pages, pausing briefly at the erased marks, the careful lines, the final question. Then she closed it. This time, she didn't press it flat. She simply placed it aside. Done. Daniel watched from across the room. You finished with it? He asked. Annie nodded. I already know the answer. Daniel smiled slightly. You do. She slid off the chair and walked toward him. Can I ask one more thing? Always. Annie looked up at him. Are you glad I said something? The question was quiet, but it carried everything. Daniel didn't hesitate. Yes, he said. I am. Annie studied his face for a second as if making sure the answer was real. Then she nodded. Me too. That was the end of it, not the story, but the question. Later that night, after Annie had gone to bed, Daniel stood once more by the window. The city stretched out beyond him, lights steady, movement constant. His phone buzzed again. Another message. Board confirms termination. Public statement releasing in the morning. Additional reforms to be announced. Daniel read it, then set the phone down. It wasn't satisfaction he felt. It wasn't victory. It was something quieter, something steadier, a sense that the truth had not been pushed aside this time. Upstairs, Annie slept peacefully. No furrow in her brow, no unfinished question waiting for an answer, just rest because the hardest part had already been done. She had spoken, she had stood by it, and this time, someone had listened. Outside, the world would keep debating, analyzing, reacting. But inside that house, one thing was already settled. The problem had never been Annie. And now finally, that answer belonged to everyone. This story reminds us that truth does not depend on authority. It depends on courage. Annie did not stand out because she was the smartest in the room, but because she chose to stay honest when it was uncomfortable and even risky. The real lesson is not about solving a math problem, but about recognizing how easily fairness can be ignored when no one speaks up. For adults, it is a call to listen more carefully and examine our own biases before judging others. For everyone, it is a reminder that justice often begins with a quiet voice refusing to stay silent. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration.